As the impeachment inquiry ramps up, President Trump's defenders have been kicking into overdrive.
What's going on in Washington, D.C. today is a disgrace.
I find the whole process to be a sham, and I'm not going to legitimize it.
And although about half of Americans say they support impeachment, around 41% still approve of the job Trump is doing, which is close to the same level of support he came into office with. So where's the disconnect? Mind control and cult expert Stephen Hassan has a theory laid out in his new book that Trump is essentially a cult leader. He joined me recently to talk about it. Steve, thank you for being here. Let me start by asking you, you are a renowned expert in your field, and I don't think of you at all as someone who is involved in the political fray. Were you apprehensive about writing this book for that reason?
Absolutely. This is my fourth book. I've always tried to talk generally about psychology, undue influence, how intelligent, educated people can be deceived and manipulated and indoctrinated to accept a black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil model of reality, and ultimately be dependent and obedient on some leader or some group.
So what made you decide you had to do it, even if people now start viewing you as a political animal rather than an expert?
Conscience. I grew up Jewish, in fact 1.3 miles from Donald Trump in Flushing, Queens. And I was recruited into a front group of the Moon cult in 1974, spent 2.5 years in it before my deprogramming. And I realized that I had become a different person, and I had become a right-wing fascist who believed the Holocaust was necessary and that it was necessary to amend the Constitution and harm people who didn't follow whatever Moon wanted. And it horrified me.
And you saw parallels between Sun Myung-moon's leadership style and President Trump's?
Absolutely. Well, I was watching during the GOP primaries him using manipulation techniques with the other people, Ted Cruz and others, using linguistic patterns that is very characteristic of destructive cults, a term called loaded language that's very evocative, that creates an image in people's heads but shuts down any analytic or critical thinking.
Give me some examples of what you're talking about, concrete examples, because I think I know
fake news.
Fake news.
Adam.
Uh-huh.
Build the wall.
Build the wall, lock her up.
Lock her up.
You mentioned. And also
enemies of the people.
Enemies of the people, right? That would be
and
me
all kinds
and
of
our
names
colleagues.
that were wordsmithed for
Lion
him.
Ted, Little
Right.
Marco. And so just flesh out a little bit more. What is it that makes things like that nefarious rather than just really good branding?
So part of what I did in my book is trace the history of propaganda and disinformation, starting with Edward Bernays in particular in his 1928 book, Propaganda. And he did the first presidential campaign, in fact, and was also hired to get women to smoke cigarettes by the tobacco industry. And what's been happening over the decades is a more refined, sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate people emotionally, psychologically, to get them to buy things that they're not interested in or don't need, to get them to vote for people that they don't even care for and wouldn't ordinarily vote for. So my book is about bringing people up to date with 21st century mind control techniques, how to protect yourself, how to identify it, and also how to help people who've been victimized by it.
Let me ask you about an episode that you highlight in the book, this pretty remarkable White House cabinet meeting at which we saw a bunch of President Trump's closest advisors go around the table and apparently vie for the honor of who could praise him the most. Let's take a look.
Thank you, Mr. President, and just the greatest privilege of my life is to serve as Vice President to a President who's keeping his word to the American people.
I can't thank you enough for the privilege that you've given me and the leadership that you've shown.
Thank you for the opportunity to help fix the trade deficit and other things.
I'm privileged to be here.
It's a privilege to serve.
Deeply honored. It's a great privilege you've given me.
An honor to be on the team.
On behalf of the entire senior staff around you, Mr. President, we thank you for the opportunity and the blessing that you've given us to serve your agenda and the American people.
So what do you see when you watch that as an expert in cults and mind control? What's going on there?
So we have a king-like figure, a god-like figure who claims to be smarter than anyone else, which is stereotypically characteristic of other cult leaders that I've worked with, where everyone is vying to praise and get the goodies, but it's also a modeling for everybody else to learn how this president wants to be treated, and later people will understand they're going to be harassed publicly and kicked out if they're not loyal and obedient.
So it's a conditioning as well as a preening. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely. So what people need to understand is that we like to think as Americans we're above having our minds manipulated or controlled, but we're human beings and we're tribal, and therefore we're subjected to influence.
Let me get you to elaborate on that a little
Sure.
bit. You, I think, titled one of the chapters in the book, I'm going to get this wrong, but something along the lines of a nation hardwired to be manipulated. That's the gist anyway. What is it that makes America right now hardwired to be manipulated? Is it the tribalism you're talking about or other factors?
So one of the universal mind control techniques is sleep deprivation. And we're chronically sleep deprived. We're also overloaded. The mind does best when we have 7 to 9 hours of sleep and we're not being information overloaded. With the smartphones and social media, we're being bombarded and overwhelmed, and the mind goes into a neutral, numb state, but the information keeps coming in. And so unless people understand they need to regulate their sleep, their food, and also get other points of view, not just only be in one information silo, they can be easily swayed.
I'm glad you brought up that last piece, because it seems to me that when people like me, lay people, think of cults and mind control, you think of a group of people that is cut off from the general population, right? There's no alternate sources of information allowed. But now I think of Facebook and their algorithm steering different kinds of people to different kinds of content. We've got that siloing going on, even though people are free to live and move wherever they want. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So what people need to understand is it would be obvious if you're being held prisoner with a gun at your head. But psychologically, what happens, as I've studied as a mental health professional, is a dissociative disorder where members are being taught to stop any negative thoughts against the leader, the doctrine, or the group. They're thinking in the language system of the organization. They have phobias or irrational fears that have been put in their mind that if they don't obey the leader or the doctrine or the group, terrible things are going to happen to them. So in the mind of someone who's under mind control, they can't imagine a choice of disagreeing with the leader and exiting.
One of the critical comments on Amazon, there were a lot of positive comments about your book, but one of the critical comments was, I wish Steve Hassan had looked at how this worked with other presidential figures. For example, at whether President Obama had used any of these techniques, because President Trump can't be the only person to have had a healthy ego and have wanted people to do what he wants them to do. So did you look at other presidents to see if they did any of this stuff, even on a lesser level than President
So
Trump?
I've been asked this question, and I think if you want to be the President of the United States, you have to have some narcissism going on. With Trump, it's malignant narcissism, so pathological lying, thinks he's above the law. It will never take responsibility if he makes a mistake and such. But essentially, yes, I have considered lots of different things. I argue in my book that Trump is a symptom of everything that's happened before him that brings us to this historical moment.
Finally, you end on a really bleak note. If President Trump, if you accept your argument that he's akin to a cult leader, then it would seem that deprogramming would begin by him losing in 2020. But at the end of the book, you write, and I'm going to quote you here, "Cult leaders do not relinquish power. If Trump runs again and is not reelected in 2020, he might claim that the election was rigged. Who knows what he might call on his followers to do in that case?" And then you go on immediately after to point out the case of Jim Jones in Guyana and the fact that over 900 of his supporters apparently took their own lives or were killed. That's a really, really bleak scenario to look ahead to. Are you concerned about something almost, I don't know what adjective to use, apocalyptic happening if the president loses in 2020?
Well, I follow the media of his base and his supporters, and they're already talking about civil war, and they're already talking about using their automatic rifles that they've been stockpiling. So I don't want to end on a bleak note, but because I am an optimist, but we really need to roll up our sleeves, understand the problem, and start approaching it as if it was a cult and not expecting him and his followers to act normally.
All right, on that bracing note, Steve Hassan, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Adam.
The book, again, is The Cult of Trump. You can catch Stephen Hassan in person Tuesday, November 19th at 7 p.m. for a drop-in signing at Belmont Books.